Earlier this week, the UK government accused China of stealing 40 million UK registered voters' names and addresses.
These actions demonstrate a clear and persistent pattern of behaviour that signals hostile intent from China.
The breach occurred in 2021 and 2022, in which time GCHQ has ascertained that China's state-affiliated actors also targeted several parliamentarians' emails, including former Conservative leader Ian Duncan Smith.
We have been subjected to harassment, impersonation and attempted hacking from China for some time. China should immediately be labelled as a threat, not as an epoch-defining systemic challenge in the integrated review.
So what's the government's response been, Freddie?
So the government hyped up this announcement on Monday. There was lots of leaks to the press, and it seemed as if this was going to be a watershed moment in the sanctions that they were going to apply to Chinese officials. It transpired that they'd also coordinated this with the US and other allies, so they also announced sanctions. I think, though, that what they actually did, I mean, they sanctioned 2 people and 1 company, and that was seen as insufficient. I mean, some of the quotes from the debate that followed are quite interesting. So we had all of these China hawks standing up and deriding the government for their response. Ian Duncan Smith sneered that the statement was like an elephant giving birth to a mouse. Ex-Minister Tim Loughton said he was underwhelmed. The SNP's Stuart McDonnell said the Deputy Prime Minister has turned up at a gunfight with a wooden spoon. Robert Jenrick said it was derisory and feeble. Alicia Kearns, who chairs the Foreign Affairs Committee, said it was sadly insufficient. So there is this divide within the Conservative Party, I think, largely between the backbenchers and the government. The government, particularly since Rishi Sunak came in and took over from Liz Truss, has been much more cautious in having a blanket approach to China. They've essentially said that they want to cooperate on some things like climate change and trade, and then they also want to pull them up on human rights issues. There are many people who think that they're not doing the latter in any way. It was interesting, before this announcement on Monday, we had a report come out from the Foreign Affairs Committee, which Alicia Kearns chairs, saying, where on earth is the government's China strategy? I mean, this is something that's been spoken about for, I think, years now. The government's promised it. I remember maybe a year and a half ago, someone going, okay, it's coming out in March, and then it's coming out in April. And we were all expecting it, and it never came. The government essentially has said now they're not going to release it. The committee essentially says this is going to impede the government and Whitehall's ability to have a coherent response to China. And that's the key issue, really. Have we got a well thought through, long-term, coherent strategy that brings the whole of government together?
Yeah, and in a way, is this latest, what's happened, a vindication of those China hawks in the Conservative Party? Because over the past few years, you have had a bit of a softening, haven't you? I think James Cleverly said we shouldn't pull the shutters down on China. He's sort of been in favour of maintaining diplomatic relations with China. He met the vice president when he came over for the coronation. Rishi Sunak sort of been in favour of smoothing over diplomatic relations too, and of course appointed David Cameron as his foreign secretary after James Cleverly, who is associated with that golden era of UK-China relations. And so you have got that growing frustration in the China skeptic sort of wing of the Conservative Party with this approach, because can you really separate? I think the question is, can you really separate, what you want from China in terms of climate change and trade from the risks of the relationship? We've seen the risks to national security that China being involved in our infrastructure could bring. Yeah.
I mean, I think part of the problem is the change in the occupant of number 10. Liz Truss was much more hawkish on China, and she has been since she left office as well. She visited Taiwan, didn't she, last year? Yeah. And Rishi Sunak, I mean, even at the Treasury, there was rumours that he was trying to dampen the China strategy to enable more trade. But I think the language in the party has shifted over the years. I remember, if you look back at 2020, 21, we had that reaction to the clampdown in Hong Kong. We had all of those reports coming out about Xinjiang and the persecution of the Uyghurs there. There was regular debates in Parliament condemning China and calling for the government to do more. You had Parliament call what's happening in Xinjiang a genocide. We've moved on from that a little bit now. I think both parties, I think Labour as well, and we can come on to Labour, have been instrumental in shifting the debate. So it has moved away from the purely human rights argument, and I think we now have the government and the backbenchers basically they're not coming to a full accommodation, but they're much closer together than they used to be.
Yeah, and it's worth remembering that Rishi Sunak, when he was running for the leadership, he called China a threat to Britain's national security. He promised to close down those Confucius institutes in UK universities, which are these China-backed kind of like areas of soft power for the Chinese state.
And hard power.
Yeah, hard power sometimes, and he hasn't. He's gone back on that since being leader. So you could see that he was, the way to try and win over the Conservative sort of grassroots was to be more hawkish. And I think, again, there's disappointment that he hasn't followed through on that as Prime Minister. I
think that's right. Why did he say that? Well, why did he say lots of things during the campaign? It was to stand up to Liz Truss, trying to meet her on her own issues, and also to appeal to those Tory members. But I think we know, because there was such shock when he announced that, given that there were so many leaks, I think it was like a month or so before, that he was trying to push for an accommodation with China over trade. He was also trying to push for I think there was another summit he was trying to get between the Treasury and the Chinese. We knew that it was slightly disingenuous, even at the time. Yeah,
and a lot of our net zero strategy is actually contingent on Chinese fossil fuels, which we've got a good data piece about, which I'll put in the show notes for today's episode. But there's definitely, very close economic links with China.
Yeah, but just to be Rishi Sunak spokesperson for a minute, he was at the liaison committee this week, and he did make a defence, and he did say, look, we are actually tougher on China than some of our allies. He pointed out the removal, which is actually, I think, still going on, but the removal to get rid of Huawei infrastructure, the 5G. Also, you had these Hikvision CCTV cameras, which will supposedly be removed from intelligence and military location. Some people are like, why is it not being removed from the government as a whole? So you've had some movement there. They will point to some sanctions they put on. Others will say there's been no way near as many as America has done. But that's his defense. So he thinks, at least he's trying to sell the story, that he has actually moved quite strongly onto China. He'll point to the EU and say that actually they're much closer on trade and other things.
Yeah. And so what are the implications of this then? Do you think that the UK's China strategy will become, a salient issue again? Will there be calls for that to come out?
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I don't think China policy in any way is a hot topic in the country. I don't think we've got people clamouring to hear what the government's going to do on China. I mean, as we've spoken about many times, I think that's a symptom of the House of Commons' refusal to engage with foreign policy often. It's not top of the agenda. I think that's in part because you've got consensus between the two parties. Going back onto the point of consensus between the two parties, we should really look at what Labour want here. And I think there has been a shift. And I think when Lisa Nandy was Shadow Foreign Secretary, she was much harsher on the government and calling for them to be tougher. And I think David Lammy and Keir Starmer since have actually moved much closer to where the government is. David Lammy's whole foreign policy is predicated on this idea of progressive realism. It's about engaging with companies. It's about not talking down to developing countries. It's about being realistic about how we can achieve progressive aims around the world and not overestimating the UK's power. And we've also seen that with China. They've got these famous 3 Cs is their China policy. I think it's to compete, challenge and cooperate. So everything, really. So we'll just cover everything, and we'll have different policies for different areas, which is, very similar to what the government want to do. So they are going to challenge them on Xinjiang and Hong Kong and Tibet, but they're also going to cooperate on climate change and trade and technology and public health and these sorts of things. Yeah, and it's interesting because I interviewed John Healey, who is the Shadow Defence Secretary, recently. And, I mean, he said it before, it's not sort of something new that he said to me, but, Labour's whole defence strategy kind of hinges on turning away from that Indo-Pacific tilt that the government, especially under Boris Johnson, established. And it almost sounded, because he was saying, we have to pull our weight more in Europe. NATO is our main obligation, with the threat of Russia. That was his focus in the interview. And it almost sounded to me as if the government under Labour would sort of leave the stage in that part of the world and not sort of and leave America to it, basically, which might be a bit unfair, but it's certainly the way that Labour's framing its sort of defence strategy and opposition. That might change when it comes into government. So it's almost as if there isn't that impetus there. Yeah, I think on defence, but perhaps, on defence, foreign policy and economic affairs slightly different. We had, for instance, Catherine West, who's the shadow minister for Asia. She was in China last week, and I do think that's essentially a prelude, a landing stage for David Lammy to visit, maybe when they get into government or just before the election. I mean, probably after the election. But that's interesting, isn't it? They're already engaging. They're already doing what James Cleverly has been criticised for doing. So, I mean, I agree. I mean, it's clear that Labour's defence policy is focused on getting a defence pact with Germany and then a defence pact with Europe as a whole, and making sure that the UK is a central actor within NATO. But I do think on the foreign policy and the economic side, you are going to see continued engagement with the Asia Pacific.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because it wasn't just the UK that was targeted. 2 weeks before, US officials confirmed that Chinese hackers had been in US systems for 5 years to prepare for an attack on American critical infrastructure. If the US has been attacked in this way, and the UK too, does that just make it? I mean, this is not the biggest issue of this story, but does it make it even less likely that the two election campaigns could run concurrently?
Oh, I've not thought about that, Anoosh. I mean, there are concerns, national security concerns. There were some reports, I think, in the papers a couple of weeks ago about the fact that the security service said it's okay for them to go ahead at the same time. Obviously, you wouldn't have a change of government in the US. Yeah. You would just have an election, and then you'd have the president-elect, and then they would be inaugurated in January. So you wouldn't have a change of government straight away. But I do think there are some concerns about this.
But in campaign communications.
Also, we should speak about technology, social media, the rise of deep fakes. There was an amazing thread today on Twitter I saw. It was just, Barack Obama saying, "Hi, I'm a deep fake." And I don't think we can underestimate the pace with which these things are going to change. And there are lots of people who are concerned, given the number of elections that we have this year. You've got the Indian election, you've got the EU elections, US, UK. There's lots of elections going on around the world, and there is, I think, considerable concern that this is the year that we're going to see the power and the danger of AI.
AI, yes, definitely. And deep fakes, I mean, you can already see that coming into social media and confusing some people, and you can imagine what havoc that could play with major election campaigns. And also, of course, you've got the TikTok issue. So TikTok is owned by a Chinese company called ByteDance, and they're collecting data every day. And we don't have the prospect of a ban or a change of TikTok as they do in the States. So, I mean, what does that mean for political campaigns in particular, but also for the sort of the way that China has its sort of tentacles in people's personal information?
Political campaigns, I think, since 2016, since that big 2008 campaign, Obama's campaign in the US, has been shifting online. And I think we're going to see that more and more. I do think that with the US coming out and saying, as you said, that they found that China have been in their infrastructure for 5 years, just points to the fact that how advanced China's infiltration with cyber attacks is. I think there was another report to suggest that, if you actually look at the number of cyber hackers that they have in China, because they use these, broader front companies, it's something like 50,000, there's 100,000 suggested. It's just way beyond, I think, what we fully comprehend in the UK and in the US. And I think slowly parliamentarians are waking up to that threat. We saw another report from the Intelligence Committee recently just setting out how broad this threat is. I think it's just going to become a more and more significant feature of elections going forwards.
Yeah, and you can see how much more important social media is to elections. I think Labour and Conservatives have spent nearly 1.8 million on Facebook and Instagram adverts so far this year. We don't even know when the election is going to be yet. And that's compared to just £191,348 last year. So obviously it's an election year, so it's ramping up, but it's interesting that it's taking up such a huge part of campaign budgets already. And so it is this big target.
Yeah, and there's concern about the fact that we've not yet seen social media companies add those watermarks, those labels onto deepfakes to identify something as AI, because someone might attribute it to a politician when it's not really them. And you've got, at the same time, as you say, Anoosh, you've got political parties pivoting towards social media. I think we've seen a real change in tone from the Tories and Labour in the past 6 months or so, in leaning into memes, leaning into these sardonic little takedowns that they do within minutes. I think they both obviously have quite well-developed social media teams. We saw that remarkable, strange, sort of 1970s Batman-esque and attack ad against Sadiq Khan this week come out. And I think we're moving in that direction. I mean, is that healthy for public debate? I think we could say that attack ads and, undermining one's opponent and using arguments that are a slight angle to the truth have always been around. Look at Vote Leave, look at some of the attack ads against Gordon Brown about releasing prisoners that we saw in 2010. It's not new for politicians to, go for the man and not the ball.
Oh, yeah. I mean, even in leaflets, even hard copies that go through people's doors.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I think there is a sense that you can reach far more people with social media. I wrote about this in Morning Call today. If you take, for instance, the BBC 6 o'clock news, it gets around 4 million viewers. If you take one of the videos that the Tories published against Sadiq Khan, it got 6 million in 3 days. So I think the magnitude and the reach that they can get is much greater.
Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.